Looks like I got 3 people here. Alright. I am trying something a little different. I have an actual mic. And I'm using my computer. So, we'll see how it sounds. You know, if you hear a significant difference in how it usually sounds, if it's clearer, more quiet, louder. Hey Victor. Good to see you on here. It's going well. The cat is not here yet. I'm sure he'll be here any minute. As soon as I start reading, he'll probably hop over. Okay. Yeah, so we left off, they were settling a bet in the archives. So, I'm just going to continue where we left off. We're about to meet Puppet, this character that we have heard a lot about and haven't met yet. Chapter 40. Puppet. The most important thing is to be polite, Simmons said in a hushed tone as we made our way through a narrow hallway lined with books. Our sympathy lamps shot bands of light through the shelves and made the shadows dance nervously. But don't patronize him. He's a bit odd, but he's not an idiot. Just treat him like you would treat anyone else. Except polite, I said sarcastically, tiring of this litany of advice. Exactly, Simmons said seriously. Where are we going anyway? I asked, mostly to stop Simmons henpecking. Sub 3, Willem said as he turned to descend a long flight of stone steps. Centuries of use had worn down the stone, making the stairs look as bowed and as heavy-laden shelves. As we started down, the shadows made the steps look smooth and dark and edgeless, like an abandoned riverbed worn from the rock. I see Katrina comment? Oh my god. Aw, thanks Katrina. That's nice. Where was I? Are you sure he's going to be there? Will nodded. I don't think he leaves his chambers very much. Chambers? I asked. He lives here? Neither of them said anything as Willem led the way down another flight of stairs, then through a long stretch of wide hallway with a low ceiling. Finally, we came to an unremarkable door tucked into a corner. If I hadn't known better, I would have assumed it was one of the countless reading holes scattered throughout the stacks. Just don't do anything to upset him, Simmons said nervously. I assumed my most polite expression as Willem rapped on the door. The handle began to turn almost immediately. The door opened a crack, then was thrown wide. Puppet stood, framed in the doorway, taller than any of us. The sleeves of his black robe billowed strikingly in the breeze of the opening door. He stared at us haughtily for a moment, then looked puzzled and brought a hand to touch the side of his head. Wait, I've forgotten my hood, he said, and kicked the door closed. Odd as his brief appearance had been, I'd noticed something more disturbing. Burned body of God, I whispered. He's got candles in there. Does Lauren know? So, my cats are going to be extra crazy because I have all of their stuff in here. Because I have someone coming to check. The supervisor at the building, of the management company of my building, is coming, hopefully coming inside tomorrow morning to, listen to the what the bass sounds like from my next door neighbor and see if he can help me out with it. I'm not allowed to have pets, so I'm hoarding all of the cats in my room while he's here. I just did it tonight so I don't have to do it in the morning. So they're very active in here right now with all of their cat tree and everything. Anyway, sorry. It's just distracting because they're making a lot of noise. Okay, he's got candles in there. Does Lauren know? Simon opened his mouth to answer when the door was thrown wide again. Puppet filled the doorway, his dark robe striking against the warm candlelight behind him. He was hooded now, with his arms upraised. The long sleeves of his robes caught the inrush of air and billowed impressively. The same rush of air caught his hood and blew it part way off his head. Damn, he said in a distracted voice. The hood settled half on, half off his head, partially covering one eye. He kicked the door shut again. Willem and Simon remained straight-faced. I refrained from any comment. There was a moment of quiet. Finally, a muffled voice came from the other side of the door. Would you mind knocking again? It doesn't seem quite right otherwise. Obediently, Willem stepped back up to the door and knocked. Once, twice, then the door swung open and we were confronted with a looming figure in a dark robe. His cowled hood shadowed his face, and the long sleeves of his robe stirred in the wind. Who calls on Taborlin the Great? Puppet intoned, his voice resonant but slightly muted by the deep hood. A hand pointed dramatically. You! Simon! There was a pause, and his voice lost its dramatic resonance. I've seen you already today, haven't I? Simon nodded. I could sense the laughter tumbling around in him, trying to find a way out. How long ago? About an hour. The hood nodded. Was I better this time? He reached up to push the hood back, and I noticed the robe was too big for him, the sleeves hanging down to his fingertips. When his face emerged from the hood, he was grinning like a child playing dress-up in his parents' clothes. You weren't doing Taborlin before, Simon admitted. Oh, Puppet seemed a little put out. How was I this time? The last time, I mean. Was it a good Taborlin? Pretty good, Simon said. Puppet looked at Willem. I liked the robe, Will said, but I always imagined Taborlin with a gentle voice. Oh, he finally looked at me. Hello. Hello, I said in my politest tone. I don't know you. A pause. Who are you? I am Cloth. You seem so certain of it, he said, looking at me intently. Another pause. They call me Puppet. Who is they? Who are they? He corrected, raising a finger. I smiled. Who are they, then? Who were they, then? Who are they now? I clarified, my smile growing wider. Puppet mirrored my smile in a distracted way and made a vague gesture with one hand. You know, them. People. He continued to stare at me the same way I might examine an interesting stone or a type of leaf I've never seen before. What do you call yourself? I asked. He seemed a little surprised, and his eyes focused onto me in a more ordinary way. That would be telling, I suspect, he said with a touch of reproach. He glanced at the silent Willem and Simon. You should come in now. He turned and walked inside. The room wasn't particularly large, but it seemed bizarrely out of place, nestled in the belly of the archives. There was a deep padded chair, a large wooden table, and a pair of doorways leading into other rooms. Books were everywhere, overflowing shelves and bookcases. They were piled on the floor, scattered across tables, and stacked on chairs. A pair of drawn curtains against one wall surprised me. My mind struggled with the impression that there must be a window behind them, despite the fact that I knew we were deep underground. The room was lit with lamps and candles, long tapers and thick dripping pillars of wax. Each tongue of flame filled me with vague anxiety as I thought of open fire in a building filled with hundreds of thousands of precious books. And there were puppets. They hung from shelves and pegs on walls. They lay crumpled in corners and under chairs. Some were in the process of being built or repaired, scattered among tools across the tabletop. There were shelves full of figurines, each cleverly carved and painted in the shape of a person. On his way to his table, Puppet shrugged out of the black robe and let it fall carelessly to the floor. He was dressed plainly underneath, wrinkled white shirt, wrinkled dark pants, and mismatched socks much mended in the heel. I realized he was older than I'd thought. His face was smooth and unlined, but his hair was pure white and thin on top. Puppet cleared a chair for me, carefully removing a small string puppet from the seat and finding it a place on a nearby shelf. He then took a seat at the table, leaving Willem and Simon standing. To their credit, they didn't seem terribly disconcerted. Digging a little in the clutter on the table, he brought out an irregularly shaped piece of wood and a small knife. He took another long, searching look at my face, then began to methodically whittle curls of wood falling onto the tabletop. Oddly enough, I had no desire to ask anyone what was going on. When you ask as many questions as I do, you learn when they are appropriate. Besides, I knew what the answers would be. Puppet was one of the talented, not quite sane people who had found a niche for themselves at the university. Arcanum training does unnatural things to students' minds. The most notable of these unnatural things is the ability to do what most people call magic, and we call sympathy, sigildry, alchemy, naming, and the like. Some minds take to it easily. Others have difficulty. The worst of these go mad and end up in haven. But most minds don't shatter when subjected to the stress of the arcanum. They simply crack a little. Sometimes these cracks showed in small ways, facial tics, stuttering. Other students heard voices, grew forgetful, went blind, went dumb. Sometimes it was only for an hour or a day. Sometimes it was forever. I guess Puppet was a student who had cracked years ago. Like Ari, he seemed to have found a place for himself, though I marveled at the fact that Lauren let him live down here. Does he always look like this? Puppet asked Willem and Simon. A small drift of pale wood shavings had gathered around his hands. Mostly, Willem said. Like what? Simon asked. Like he's just thought through his next 3 moves in a game of tyranny and figured out how he's going to beat you. Puppet took another long look at my face and shaved another thin strip of wood away. It's rather irritating, really. Willem barked a laugh. That's his thinking face, Puppet. He wears it a lot, but not all the time. What's a tyranny? Simon asked. A thinker, Puppet mused. What are you thinking now? I'm thinking you must be a very careful watcher of people, Puppet, I said politely. Puppet snorted without looking up. What use is care? What good is watching, for that matter? People are forever watching things. They should be seeing. I see the things I look at. I am a seer. He looked at the piece of wood in his hand, then to my face. Apparently satisfied, he folded his hands over the top of his carving, but not before I glimpsed my own profile cunningly wrought in wood. Do you know what you have been, what you are not, and what you will be? He asked. It sounded like a riddle. No. A seer, he said with certainty, because that is what Ilir means. Kvoth is actually a Relar, Simon said respectfully. Puppet sniffed disparagingly. Hardly, he said, looking at me closely. You might be a seer eventually, but not yet. Now you are a looker. You will be a true Ilir at some point, if you learn to relax. He held out the carved wooden face. What do you see here? It was no longer an irregular piece of wood. My features, locked in serious contemplation, stared out of the wood grain. I leaned forward to get a closer look. Puppet laughed and threw up his hands. Too late, he exclaimed, looking childlike for a moment. You looked too hard and didn't see enough. Too much looking can get in the way of seeing, you see? Oh, hey, lots of people are just coming to visit this reading. Hi, Bob. I don't know if you're still there. That was 3 minutes ago. That's random. Okay. Puppet set the carved face on the tabletop so it seemed to be staring at one of the recumbent puppets. See little wooden Kvoth? See him looking? So intent, so dedicated. He'll look for 100 years, but will he ever see what is in front of him? Puppet settled back in his seat, his eyes wandering the room in a contented way. Ilir means seer? Simon asked. Do the other ranks mean things too? As a student with full access to the archives, I imagine you can find that out for yourself, Puppet said. His attention focused on a puppet on the table in front of him. He lowered it to the floor carefully to avoid tangling its strings. It was a perfect miniature of a grey-robed Talon priest. Would you have any advice as to where he could start looking? I asked, playing a hunch. Runfalk's dictum. Under Puppet's direction, the Talon puppet raised himself from the floor and moved each of his limbs as if he were stretching after a long sleep. I'm not familiar with that one. Puppet responded in a distracted voice. It's on the 2nd floor in the southeast corner, 2nd row, 2nd rack, 3rd shelf, right-hand side, red leather binding. The miniature Talon priest walked slowly around Puppet's feet. Clutched tightly in one hand was a tiny replica of the Book of the Path, perfectly fashioned, right down to the tiny spoked wheel painted on the cover. The 3 of us watched Puppet pull the strings of the little priest, making it walk back and forth before finally coming to sit on one of the puppet's stocking-clad feet. Willem cleared his throat respectively. Puppet? Yes, Puppet replied without looking up from his feet. You have a question, or rather, Kvoth has a question, and you're thinking of asking it for him. He is sitting slightly forward in his seat. There is a furrow between his brows and a pursing of the lips that gives it away. Let him ask me. It might do him good. I froze in place, catching myself doing each of the things he had mentioned. Puppet continued to work the strings of his little Talon. It made a careful, fearful search of the area. It made a careful, fearful search of the area around his feet, brandishing the book in front of itself before stepping around table legs and peering into Puppet's abandoned shoes. Its movements were uncanny, and it distracted me to the point where I forgot I was uncomfortable and felt myself relax. I was wondering about the Emir, actually. My eyes remained on the scene unfolding at Puppet's feet. Another marionette had joined the show, a young girl in a peasant dress. She approached the Talon and held out a hand as if trying to give him something. No, she was asking him a question. The Talon turned his back on her. She laid a timid hand on his arm. He took a haughty step away. I was wondering who disbanded them, Emperor Nalto or the Church. Still looking, he admonished more gently than before. You need to go chase the wind for a while. You are too serious. It will lead you into trouble. The Talon suddenly turned on the girl. Trembling with rage, it menaced her with the book. She took a startled step backward and stumbled to her knees. The Church disbanded them, of course. Only an edict from the Pontifex had the ability to effect them. The Talon struck the girl with the book. Once, twice, driving her to the ground, where she lay terribly still. Nalto couldn't have told them to cross the other side of the street. Some slight motion drew Puppet's eye. Oh, dear me, he said, cocking his head toward Willem. See what I see? The head bows slightly. The jaw clenches, but the eyes aren't fixed on anything, aiming the irritation inward. If I were the sort of person who judged by looking, I'd guess Willem had just lost a bet. Don't you know the church frowns on gambling? At Puppet's feet, the priest brandished the book upward at Willem. The Tellin brought his hands together and turned away from the crumpled woman. It took a stately step or two away and bowed its head as if praying. I managed to pull my attention away from the tableau and look up at our host. Puppet, I asked, have you read The Lights of History by Feltamy Rice? I saw Simon give Willem an anxious look, but Puppet didn't seem to find anything odd about the question. The Tellin at his feet stood and started to dance and caper about. Yes. Why would Rice say the Alpura Prolicia Emir was Emperor Nalto's 63rd decree? Rice wouldn't say any such thing, Puppet said, without looking up from the marionette at his feet. That's pure nonsense. But we found a copy of Lights that said exactly that, I pointed out. Puppet shrugged, watching the Tellin dance at his feet. It could be a transcription mistake, Willem mused. Depending on the edition of the book, the church itself might be responsible for changing that piece of information. Emperor Nalto is history's favorite whipping boy. It could be the church trying to distance itself from the Emir. They did some terrible things toward the end. Clever, clever, Puppet said. At his feet, Tellin made a sweeping bow in Willem's direction. I was struck by a sudden idea. Puppet, I asked, do you know what is behind the locked door on the floor above this one? The large stone door? The Tellin stopped dancing, and Puppet looked up. He gave me a long, stern look. His eyes were serious and clear. I don't think the four-plate door should be of any concern to a student, do you? I felt myself flush. No, sir. I looked away from his eyes. The tension of the moment was broken by the distant sound of the belling tower. Simon cursed softly. I'm late, he said. I'm sorry, Puppet. I've got to go. Puppet stood and hung the Tellin on the wall. It's time I got back to my reading, regardless, he said. He moved to the padded chair, sat, and opened a book. Bring this one back sometime. He gestured in my direction without looking up from his book. I have some more work to do on him. Okay, that was the end of that chapter. Alright, chapter 41, The Greater Good. I looked up at Simon and whispered, Evara enim uge. Sim gave a despairing sigh. You were supposed to be studying your physiognomy. It had been a full span since we had set fire to Ambrose's rooms, and winter was finally showing its teeth, covering the university with knee-deep drifts of blowing snow. As was always the case when the weather turned inclement, the archives were full to the brim with industrious students, and here comes the cat. You're late. Since all the reading holes were occupied, Simon and I had been forced to bring our books to tomes. The high-ceilinged, windowless room was more than half full today, but still quiet as a crypt. All the dark stone and muted whispers made the place slightly eerie, making it obvious why students referred to it as tomes. I am studying my physiognomy, I protested softly. I was looking at some of Gibeah's diagrams. Look what I found. I held out a book for him to see. Gibeah, Simon whispered, horrified. I swear the only reason you study with me is so you can interrupt. He pulled away from the book I was offering him. It's nothing grotesque, I protested. Just look at what it says here. Simon shoved the book away, and my temper flared. Careful, I hissed. This is one of his originals. I found it behind some other books, buried in dead ledgers. Lorne will cut off my thumbs if anything happens to it. Sim recoiled from the book as if it were red hot. An original? Merciful Tolu, it's probably written on human skin. Get it away from me. Yeah, that's a good point, Eric. I almost joked about how human skin probably wouldn't take ink, but decided against it when I saw the expression on Sim's face. Still, my expression must have given me away. You're perverse, he spat, his voice almost rising to unacceptable levels. God's mother, don't you know he cut apart living men to watch their organs work? I refused to look at anything that monster was responsible for. I set the book down. You might as well give up studying medicine, then, I said, as gently as possible. Gibeah's research on the human body was the most thorough ever done. His journals are the backbone of modern physics. Simon's face stayed hard, and he leaned forward so he could speak softly and still be heard. When the Emir moved against the Duke, they found the bones of 20,000 people. Great pits of bones and ashes, women and children. 20,000! Simmons sputtered a bit before he could continue. And those are just the ones they found. I let him calm himself a bit before I said, Gibeah wrote 23 volumes concerning the machinery of the body, I pointed out as gently as I could. When the emir moved against him, part of his estate burned. 4 of those volumes and all his notes were lost. Ask Master Arwell what he would give to have those volumes whole again. Simon brought his hand down hard on the tabletop, causing several students to look in our direction. Damn it, he hissed. I grew up 30 miles from Gibeah. From my father's hills you can see the ruins on a cloudless day. That stilled me. If Sim's family lands were that close, his ancestors must have been fealty-bound to Gibeah. That meant they might have been forced to help him gather subjects for his experiments. Some of his family might have ended up in the pits of bone and ash themselves. I waited a long while before I whispered again. I didn't know. He regained most of his composure. We don't talk about it, he said stiffly, brushing the hair out of his eyes. We bent to our studies, and it was an hour before Simmons spoke again. What did you find? He asked too casually, as if not wanting to admit his curiosity. Here on the inner leaf, I whispered excitedly. I opened the cover and Sim's face twisted unconsciously as he looked down at the page, as if the book smelled of death. Spilled it all over, I heard a voice as a pair of older students strolled into the hall. By their rich clothes I could tell they were both nobility, and while they weren't shouting, they weren't making any effort to be quiet either. Anasat made him clear up the mess before he let him wash off. He'll smell like urea for a span of days. What's here to see? Simon asked, looking down at the page. It's just his name and the dates. Not the middle. Look up at the top, around the edges of the page. I pointed at the decorative scrollwork. Right there. I'd wager a drab the little pug poisons himself before the term's through, the other one said. Were we ever that stupid? I still don't see anything, Simon said softly, making a baffled gesture with both his elbows on the table. It's pretty enough if you like that sort of thing, but I've never been a great fan of illuminated texts. We could head to the Twopenny, the conversation continued several tables away, drawing annoyed looks from surrounding students. They've got a girl in there who plays the pipes. I swear you've never seen anything like her before. And Linton says if you've got a bit of silver, she... His voice dropped conspiratorially. She what? I asked, butting into their conversation as rudely as possible. I didn't need to shout. In the tomes, a normal speaking voice carries the whole room. I'm afraid I didn't quite catch that last bit. The two of them gave me affronted looks, but didn't reply. What are you doing? Sim hissed at me, embarrassed. I'm trying to shut them up, I said. Just ignore them, he said. Here, I'm looking at your damn book. Show me what you want me to see. Gibeah sketched all his own journals, I said. This is his original, so it makes sense that he did his own scroll work too, right? Sim nodded and brushed his hair back from his eyes. What do you see there? I slowly pointed from one piece of scroll work to another. Do you see it? Sim shook his head. I pointed again, more precisely. There, I said, and there in the corner. His eyes widened. Letters! I... V... He paused to puzzle them out. Ivarit inem yuj. That's what you were rambling about. He pushed the book away. So what's the point, aside from the fact that he was nearly illiterate in Temic? It's not Temic, I pointed out. It's Tema, an archaic usage. What is it even supposed to say? He looked up from his book, his brow creasing. Toward great good? I shook my head. For greater good, I corrected. Sound familiar? I don't know how long she'll be there, one of the loud pair continued. If you miss her, you'll regret it. I told you, I can't tonight. Maybe on Felling. I'll be free on Felling. You should go before then, I told him. The Twopennies crowded Felling night. They gave me irritated looks. Mind your own business, slipstick, the taller one said. That got my back up even more. I'm sorry, weren't you talking to me? Did it look like I was talking to you? He said scathingly. It sounded like it, I said. If I can hear you 3 tables away, you must want me to be part of your conversation. I cleared my throat. The only alternative is that you're too thick to keep your voice down in the tomes. His face flushed red, and he probably would have replied, but his friend said something in his ear, and they both gathered their books and left. There was a quiet scattering of applause as the door closed behind them. I gave my audience a smile and a wave. The Scrivs would have taken care of that, Sim reproached softly as we leaned back over the table to talk. The Scrivs weren't taking care of it, I pointed out. Besides, it's quiet again, and that's what matters. Now, what does for greater good remind you of? The Emir, of course, he said. It's always the Emir with you lately. What's your point? The point, I whispered excitedly, is that Gibeah was a secret member of the Order Emir. Sim gave me a skeptical look. That's a bit of a stretch, but I suppose it fits. That was about 50 years before they were denounced by the church. They were pretty corrupt by then. I wanted to point out that Gibeah wasn't necessarily corrupt. He was pursuing the Emir's purpose, the greater good. While his experiments had been horrifying, his work advanced medicine in ways it was almost impossible to comprehend. His work had probably saved 10 times that many lives in hundreds of years since. However, I doubted Sim would appreciate my point. Corrupt or not, he was a secret member of the Emir. Why else would he hide their credo in the front cover of his journal? Simon shrugged. Fine, he was one of the Emir. What does that have to do with the price of butter? I threw up my hands in frustration and struggled to keep my voice low. That means the order had secret members before the church denounced them. That means when the pontifex disbanded them, the Emir had hidden allies that could keep them safe. That means the Emir could still exist today, in secret, pursuing their work in subtle ways. I noticed a change in Simon's face. At first I thought he was about to agree with me. Then I felt a prickle on the back of my neck and realized the truth. Hello, Master Lauren, I greeted him respectfully without turning around. Speaking with students at other tables is not permitted, he said from behind me. You are suspended for 5 days. I nodded, and the two of us came to our feet and gathered up our things. Expressionless, Master Lauren reached out a long hand toward me. I handed Gibeah's journal over without comment, and a minute later we were blinking in the chill winter sunlight outside the archive's doors. I pulled my cloak around me and stomped the snow off my feet. Suspended, Simon said. That was clever. I shrugged, more embarrassed than I cared to admit. I hoped one of the other students would explain I was actually trying to keep things quiet, rather than the other way around. I was just trying to do the right thing. Simon laughed as we began to walk slowly in the direction of anchors. He kicked playfully at a small drift of snow. The world needs people like you, Simon said in a tone of voice that let me know he was turning philosophical. You get things done. Not always the best way, or the most sensible way, but it gets done nonetheless. You're a rare creature. How do you mean? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Sim shrugged. Like today. Something bothers you, someone offends you, and suddenly you're off. He made a quick motion with the flat hand. You know exactly what to do. You never hesitate. You just see and react. He was thoughtful for a moment. I imagine that's the way the Emir used to be. Small wonder folk were frightened of them. I'm not always so terribly sure of myself, I admitted. Simon smiled. I find that strangely reassuring. Hey, Frankie. Yeah, he gets in trouble a lot, this guy. But all the most special, clever people do, right? They're the ones that are misbehaving all the time. It's like well-behaved men never make history either, I guess. And yeah, those people were very annoying. I was annoyed as well. This writer conveyed that very well. I feel like I want to lean back, but I don't know how far away I can be. This is a new mic, so let me know if my voice is coming through okay or if it's too quiet. I know I said that already, but just a reminder. I haven't heard anything, so I'm assuming it's fine. Anyway, chapter 42, Penance. Since studying wasn't an option and winter was covering everything in drifts of blowing snow, I decided this was the perfect time to catch up on a few things I'd been letting fall by the wayside. I tried to pay Ori a visit, but ice covered the rooftops and the courtyard where we usually met. And the courtyard where we usually met was full of drifted snow. I was glad I didn't see any footprints, as I didn't think Ori owned shoes, let alone a coat or hat. I would have gone searching for her in the underthing, but the iron grate in the courtyard was locked and iced over. I worked a few double shifts in the Medica, and played an extra night at Anchors as an apology for the evening when I'd had to leave early. Thanks, Stephen, for the thumbs up. I worked long hours in the fishery, calculating, running tests, and casting alloys for my project. I also made a point of catching up on a month of lost sleep. But there is only so much sleeping one person can do, and by the 4th day of my suspension, I'd run out of excuses. As much as I didn't want to, I needed to talk to Debbie. By the time I made up my mind to go, the weather had warmed just enough so that the falling snow had turned to sheets of freezing sleet. It was a miserable walk to Imre. I didn't have a hat or gloves, and the wind-driven sleet soaked my cloak within 5 minutes. In 10 minutes I was wet through to the skin and wishing I'd waited or spent the money on a carriage. The sleet had melted the snow on the road, and the damp slush was inches thick. I stopped by the Aeolian to warm myself a bit before heading to Debbie's, but the building was locked and lightless for the first time I'd ever seen. Small wonder. What noble would come out in this weather? What musician would expose their instrument to the freezing damp? So I slogged my way through the deserted streets, eventually coming to the alley behind the butcher's shop. It was the first time I could remember the stairway not smelling of rancid fat. I knocked on Debbie's door, alarmed by how numb my hand was. I could barely feel my knuckles hitting the door. I waited for a long moment, then knocked again, worried that she might not be in, and I'd come all this way for nothing. The door opened just a little. Warm lamplight and a single icy blue eye peered out through the crack. Then the door opened wide. "Telu's tits and teeth," Debbie said. "What are you doing out in this?" I thought, "No, you didn't," she said disparagingly. "Get in here." I stepped inside, dripping, the hood of my cloak plastered to my head. She closed the door behind me, then locked and bolted it. Looking around, I noticed she'd added a second bookshelf, though it was still mostly bare. I shifted my weight, and a great mass of damp slush dislodged itself from my cloak and splattered wetly onto the floor. Debbie gave me a long, dispassionate looking over. I could see a fire crackling in the grate on the other side of the room near her desk, but she made no indication that I should come any farther into the room. So I remained where I was, dripping and shivering. "You never do things the easy way, do you?" she said. "There's an easy way?" I asked. She didn't laugh. "If you think showing up here, half frozen and looking like a kicked dog, is going to improve my disposition toward you, you're terribly—" She trailed off and looked at me thoughtfully for another long moment. "I'll be damned," she said, sounding surprised. "I actually do like seeing you like this. It's lifting my spirits to an almost irritating degree." "It wasn't really my intention," I said, "but I'll take it. Would it help if I caught a terrible cold?" Debbie considered it. "It might," she admitted. "Penance does involve a certain amount of suffering." I nodded, not having to work to look miserable. I dug into my purse with clumsy fingers and brought out a small bronze coin I'd won off Sim playing low-stakes breath several nights ago. Debbie took it. "A penance piece," she said, unimpressed. "Is this supposed to be symbolic?" I shrugged, causing more slush to spatter to the floor. "Somewhat," I said. "I thought of going to a money changer and settling my entire debt with you in penance coin." "What stopped you?" she asked. "I realized it would just irritate you," I said, "and I wasn't looking forward to paying the money changer's fee." I fought the urge to look longingly at the fireplace. "I spent a lot of time trying to think of some gesture that might make a suitable apology to you." Yeah, the swear phrases in this book are just great. "You decided it would be best to walk here during worst weather of the year?" "I decided it would be best if we talked," I said. "The weather was just a happy accident." Debbie scowled and turned toward the fireplace. "Come in, then." She walked over to a chest of drawers near her bed and brought out a thick blue cotton robe. She handed it to me and motioned to a closed door. "Go change out of your wet clothes. Wring them out in the basin or they'll take forever to dry." I did as she said, then brought the clothes out and hung them on the pegs in front of the fire. It felt wonderful to stand so close to the fireplace. In the light of the fire, I could see that the skin under my fingernails was actually a little blue. As much as I wanted to linger and warm myself, I had joined Debbie at her desk. I noticed that the top of it had been sanded down and revarnished, though it still bore a coal-black ring where the poor boy had charred the wood. I felt rather vulnerable sitting there wearing nothing but the robe she'd given me, but there was nothing to be done about it. After our previous meeting, I fought to avoid looking at the charred ring on her desk. "You informed me that the full amount of my loan would be due at the end of the term. Are you willing to renegotiate that?" "Unlikely," Debbie said crisply. "But rest assured that if you are unable to settle accounts in coin, I'm still in the market for certain pieces of information." She gave a sharp, hungry smile. I nodded. She still wanted access to the archives. "I was hoping you might be willing to reconsider, as you now know the whole story," I said. "Someone was performing malfeasance against me. I needed to know that my blood was safe." I gave her a questioning look. Debbie shrugged without taking her elbows off the desk, her expression one of vast indifference. "What's more," I said, meeting her eye, "it is entirely possible that my irrational behavior might have been partially due to the lingering effect of an alchemical poison I was subjected to earlier this term." Debbie's expression went stiff. "What?" She hadn't known then. That was something of a relief. "Ambrose arranged to have me dosed with the plum bob about an hour before my admissions interview," I said, "and you sold him the formula." "You have a lot of gall!" Debbie's pixie face was outraged and indignant, but it wasn't convincing. She was off balance and trying too hard. "What I have," I said calmly, "is the lingering taste of plum and nutmeg in my mouth, and the occasional irrational desire to choke people for doing nothing more offensive than jostling me on the street." Her false outrage fell away. "You can't prove anything," she said. I don't need to prove anything, I said. I have no desire to see you in trouble with the masters or up against the iron law. I looked at her. I just thought you might be interested in the fact that I was poisoned. Devi sat very still. She fought to maintain her composure, but guilt was creeping onto her expression. Was it bad? It was, I said quietly. Devi looked away and crossed her arms in front of her chest. I didn't know it was for Ambrose, she said. Some rich tosh came around, made a stunningly good offer. She looked back at me. Now that the chilly anger had left her, she looked surprisingly small. I'd never do business with Ambrose, she said, and I didn't know it was for you, I swear. You knew it was for someone, I said. There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire. Here's how I see it, I said. Recently we've both done something rather foolish, something we regret. I pulled the robe more closely around my shoulders. And while these two things certainly don't cancel each other out, it does seem to me that they establish some sort of equilibrium. I held out my hands as if they were the balancing plates on a scale. Devi gave me a small, embarrassed smile. Perhaps I was hasty in demanding full repayment. I returned the smile and felt myself relax. How would you feel about sticking to the original terms of our loan? That seems fair. Devi held out her hand over the desk and I shook it. The last of the tension in the room evaporated and I felt a long-standing piece of worry unknot itself in my chest. Your hand is freezing, Devi said. Let's go sit by the fire. We relocated ourselves and sat quietly for several minutes. God's below, Devi said with an explosive sigh. I was so angry with you. She shook her head. I don't know if I've ever been that angry with anyone in my whole life. I nodded. I didn't really believe you'd stoop to malfeasance, I said. I was so sure it couldn't be you, but everyone kept talking about how dangerous you were, telling stories. Then when you wouldn't let me see my blood, I trailed off, shrugging. Are you really still getting after echoes from the plumb bob? She asked. Little flashes, I said, and I seem to be losing my temper more easily, but that might just be the stress. Simmons says I probably have unbound principles in my system, whatever that means. Devi scowled. I'm working with less than ideal equipment here, she said, gesturing to a closed door, and I am sorry, but the fellow offered me a full set of Vautium Tegnoste. She waved to the bookshelves. Normally I'd never make something like that, but unexpurgated copies are just impossible to find. I turned to look at her, surprised. You made it for him? It's better than handing over the formula, Debbie said defensively. Part of me felt like I should be angry, but the majority of me was simply happy that I was warm and dry, with no threat of death hanging over me. I shrugged it off. Simmons says you can't factor worth half a damn, I said conversationally. Debbie looked down at her hands. I'm not proud of selling it, she admitted. Then, after a moment, she looked up again, grinning. But the Tegnoste has gorgeous illustrations. I laughed. Show me. Hours later, my clothes were dry and the sleet had changed to a gentle snow. Stonebridge would be a solid sheet of ice, but other than that, the walk home would be much more pleasant. When I emerged from the washroom, I saw Debbie was sitting back at her desk. I made my way over and handed her the robe. I won't impugn your honor by asking why you own a robe much longer and broader in the shoulder than anything a delicate young lady of your size could ever wear. Hello. Wow, that was aggressive. Debbie snorted indelicately and rolled her eyes. I sat down and tugged on my boots. They were delightfully warm from sitting near the fire. Then I brought out my purse and laid 3 heavy silver talents on the desk, pushing them toward her. Debbie looked at them curiously. I've recently come into a little money, I said. Not enough to settle my whole debt, but I can pay this term's interest early. I waved a hand at the coins, a gesture of good faith. Debbie smiled and pushed the coins back across the table. You've still got 2 span before the end of the term, she said. Like I said, let's stick to our original deal. I'd feel bad about taking your money early. Though I'd offered Debbie the money as an honest peace offering, I was glad to keep my 3 talents for now. There is a vast difference between having some coin and no coin. There is a feeling of helplessness that comes from having an empty purse. It's like seed grain. At the end of a long winter, if you have some grain left, you can use it for seed. If you have control over your life, you have control over your life. You can use that grain and make plans for the future. But if you have no grain for seed in the spring, you are helpless. No amount of hard work or good intention will make crops grow, and if you don't have the seed to start with. So I bought clothes. 3 shirts, a new pair of pants, and thick woolen socks. I bought a hat and gloves and scarf to keep away the winter's chill. For Ari, I bought a pouch of sea salt, a stack of dried peas, two jars of peach preserves, and a pair of warm slippers. I bought a set of lute strings, ink, and a half-dozen sheets of paper. I also bought a sturdy brass drop bar and screwed it to the window frame in my tiny garret room. I could circumvent it fairly easily, but it would keep my few possessions safe from even the most well-intentioned thieves. Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more. We sure do. Yeah, let's do at least one more, if not two. We'll see. Chapter 43. Without word or warning. I stared out the front window of Anchor's, looking at the falling snow and idly turning Denna's ring over in my fingers. Winter lay heavy over the university, and Denna had been gone for more than a month. I had 3 hours before class with Illidan, and I was trying to decide if the slim chance of finding Denna was worth the long, cold walk to Imra. As I stood at the window, a Steeldish man came through the door, stomping the powdery snow from his boots and looking around curiously. It was still early in the day, and I was the only person in the common room. He walked over to me, snowflakes melting in his beard until they were bright beads of water. "Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for a fellow," he said, surprising me with his utter lack of anything resembling a Steeldish accent. He reached inside his long coat and pulled out a thick envelope with a blood-red seal. "Kvathi," he read slowly, then turned the envelope toward me so that I could see the front. "Kvath, Anchor's Inn, University, 2 miles west of Imra. Benelay Baron, Central Commonwealth." Oh, Belenay Baron. It was Denna's handwriting. "It's Kvath, actually," I said absent-mindedly. The E is silent. He shrugged. "You him?" "I am," I said. He nodded, satisfied. "Well, I got this down in Tarbean about a span back. Bought it off a fellow for a hard penny. He said he bought it off a sailor in Junpui for a vintage silver bit." He couldn't remember the name of the town where the sailor had got it from, but it was inland a ways. The man met my eye. "I'm telling you this so you don't think I'm trying to shim you on the deal. I paid a full hard penny, then came over myself from Imra though it was out of the way." He looked around the common room. "Though I'm guessing a fellow with a fine inn such as this won't quibble about giving a fellow his due." I laughed. "This isn't my inn," I said. "I just have a room here." "Oh," he said, obviously a little disappointed. "You looked kind of proprietorial standing there. Still, I'm sure you see I need to make my money off this." "I do," I said. "How much do you think is fair?" He looked me up and down, eyeing my clothes. "I suppose I'd be happy making my hard penny back and a soft penny besides." I brought out my purse and fished around in it. Luckily, I'd been playing cards a few nights before and had some Alturan currency. "Seems fair," I said as I handed over the money. He started to go, then turned back. "Out of curiosity," he asked, "would you have paid 2 hard pennies to get it?" "Probably," I admitted. "Kissed," he swore, then headed back outside, the door banging behind him. The envelope was heavy parchment, wrinkled and smudged with much handling. The seal showed a stag rampant standing before a barrel and a harp. I pressed it hard between my fingers, shattering it as I sat down. The letter read, "Kvath, I'm sorry to leave Imra without word or warning." Name of the chapter. "I sent you a message the night of my departure, but I expect you never received it. I have gone abroad looking for greener pasture and better opportunity. I am fond of Imra and enjoy the pleasure of your occasional, though sporadic, company, but it is an expensive city in which to live, and my prospects have grown slender of late. Ill is lovely, all rolling hills. I find the weather quite to my liking. It is warmer and the air smells of the sea. It seems I might pass an entire winter without being brought to bed by my lungs, my first in years. I have spent some time in the small kingdoms and saw a skirmish between 2 bands of mounted men. Such a crashing and screaming of horses you have never heard. I have spent some time afloat as well, and learned all manner of sailors' knots, and how to spit properly. Also, my cussing has been greatly broadened. If you ask politely when we next meet, I may demonstrate my newfound skills. I have seen my first Adem mercenary. They call them bloodshirts here. She is hardly bigger than me, with quite the most remarkable grey eyes. She is pretty, but strange and quiet, endlessly twitching. I have not seen her fight, and am not sure I wish to, though I am curious. I am still enamored of the harp, and am currently housing with a skilled gentleman, whom I shall not name, for the furtherance of my study in this. I have drunk some wine while writing this letter. I mention this to excuse my above spelling of the word furtherance. Furtherance. I mean, this does not work over non-visually, whatever the word is. She spelled it. Yeah, that's why I was having trouble the first time, because she spelled it Furthurinse, like furtherance. And the second time was furtherance, ENC, and then she wrote furtherance, ANC. Anyway, kissed, you know what I mean. I apologize for not writing sooner, but I have been a great deal traveling, and not until now have I had means to write a letter. Now that I have done, I expect it might be a while longer before I find a traveler I trust to start this missive on its long road back to you. I think of you often and fondly. Yours, D. Postscript. I hope your lute case is serving you well. Elodin's class began strangely that day. For one, Elodin was actually on time. This caught us unprepared, as the 6 remaining students had taken to spending the first 20 or 30 minutes of the class gossiping, playing cards, and griping about how little we were learning. We didn't even notice Master Namer until he was halfway down the steps of the lecture hall, clapping his hands to get our attention. The second odd thing was that Elodin was dressed in his formal robes. I'd seen him wear them before when occasion demanded, but always grudgingly. Even during admissions interviews, they were usually rumpled and unkempt. Today he wore them as if he meant it. They looked sharp and freshly laundered. His hair wasn't in its normal state of dishevel either. It looked like it had been trimmed and combed. Reaching the front of the lecture hall, he climbed onto the dais and moved to stand behind the lectern. This, more than anything, made everyone sit up and take notice. Elodin never used the lectern. Long ago, he said without any preamble, this was a place where people came to learn secret things. Men and women came to the university to study the shape of the world. Elodin looked out at us. In this ancient university, there was no skill more sought after than naming. All else was base metal. Namers walked these streets like tiny gods. They did terrible, wonderful things, and all others envied them. Only through skill in naming did students move through the ranks. An alchemist without any skill in naming was regarded as a sad thing, no more respected than a cook. Sympathy was invented here, but a sympathist without any naming might as well be a carriage driver. An artificer with no names behind his work was little more than a cobbler or a smith. They all came to learn the names of things, Elodin said, his dark eyes intense, his voice resonant and stirring. But naming cannot be taught by rule or rote. Teaching someone to be a namer is like teaching someone to fall in love. It is hopeless. It cannot be done. Master Namer smiled a bit then, for the first time looking like his familiar self. Still, students tried to learn, and teachers tried to teach, and sometimes they succeeded. Elodin pointed. Fela! He motioned for her to approach. Come! Fela stood, looking nervous as she climbed up to join him on the lecture's dais. You have all chosen the name you hope to learn, Elodin said, his eyes sweeping over us, and you have all pursued your studies with varying degrees of dedication and success. I fought the urge to look away shamefacedly, knowing that my efforts had been half-hearted at best. Where you have failed, Fela has succeeded, Elodin said. She has found the name of Stone. He turned sideways to look at her. How many times? 8 times, she said, looking down, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. There was a murmur of genuine awe from all of us. She had never mentioned this in our frequent griping sessions. Elodin nodded, as if approving of our reaction. When naming was still taught, we namers wore our prowess proudly. A student who gained mastery over a name would wear a ring as declaration of their skill. Elodin stretched out a hand in front of Fela and opened it, revealing a river stone, smooth and dark. And this is what Fela will do now, as proof of her ability. Startled, Fela looked at Elodin. Her eyes flickered back and forth between him and the stone, her face growing stricken and pale. Elodin gave her a reassuring smile. Come now, he said gently. You know in your secret heart you are capable of this, and more. Fela bit her lips and took hold of the stone. It seemed bigger in her hands than it had in his. She closed her eyes for a moment and drew a long, deep breath. She let it out slowly, lifted the stone, and opened her eyes so it was the first thing she would see. Yeah, I can't wait for the new curse words. The new level of cursing. Fela stared at the stone, and there was a long moment's silence. The tension in the room built until it was tight as a harp string. The air vibrated with it. A long minute passed. 2 long minutes. 3 terribly long minutes. Elodin sighed gustily, breaking the tension. No, 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 he said, snapping his fingers near her face to get her attention. He pressed a hand over her eyes like a blindfold. You're looking at it. Don't look at it. Look at it. He pulled his hand away. Fela lifted the stone and opened her eyes. At the same moment, Illidan gave her a sharp slap on the back of the head with the flat of his hand. She turned to him, her expression outraged, but Illidan merely pointed at the stone she still held in her hand. Look! He said excitedly. Fela's eyes went to the stone, and she smiled as if seeing an old friend. She covered it with a hand and brought it close to her mouth. Her lips moved. There was a sudden sharp cracking sound, as if a speck of water had been dropped into a pan of hot grease. There followed dozens more, so sharp and quick they sounded like an old man popping his knuckles, or a storm of hailstones hitting a hard slate roof. Fela opened her hand, and a scattering of sand and gravel spilled out. With 2 fingers she reached into the jumble of loose stone and pulled out a ring of sheer black stone. It was round as a cup and smooth as polished glass. Illidan laughed in triumph before sweeping Fela into an enthusiastic hug. Fela threw her arms around him wildly in return. They took several quick steps together that were half stagger, half dance. Still grinning, Illidan held out his hand. Fela gave him the ring, and he looked it over carefully before nodding. Fela, he said seriously, I hereby promote you to the rank of Relar. He held up the ring. Your hand. Almost shyly, Fela held out her hand, but Illidan shook his head. Left hand, he said firmly. The right means something else entirely. None of you are anywhere near ready for that. Fela held out her other hand, and Illidan slid the ring of stone easily onto her finger. The rest of the class broke into applause, rushing close to get a look at what she had done. Fela gave a radiant smile and held out her hand for all of us to see. The ring wasn't as smooth as I'd first thought. It was covered in 1,000 tiny flat facets. They circled each other in a subtle, swirling pattern unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Okay. Maybe I'll do one more. What do you guys think? This one is kind of a longer one. This next one, actually no, it's not that long. Yeah, it's pretty short. I'll just do one more. Might as well. Okay, drink water. Chapter 44, The Catch. Despite the trouble with Ambrose, my obsession with the archives, and my countless fruitless trips to Imra hunting Denna, I managed to finish my project in the fishery. I would have liked another span of days to run a few more tests and tinker with it, but I was simply out of time. The admissions lottery was coming up soon, and my tuition would be due not long after. Before I could put my project up for sale, I needed Kilvin to approve my design. So it was with no small amount of trepidation that I knocked on the door of Kilvin's office. The master artificer was hunched over his personal work table, carefully removing the screws from the bronze casing of a compression pump. He didn't look up as he spoke. Yes, Relarkvoth? I'm finished, Master Kilvin, I said simply. He looked up at me, blinking. Are you now? Yes, I was hoping to make an appointment so I might demonstrate it to you. Kilvin set the screws in a tray and brushed his hands together. For this I am available now. I nodded and led the way through the busy workshop, past stocks, to the private workroom Kilvin had assigned me. I brought out the key and unlocked the heavy timber door. It was large as workrooms go, with its own firewall, anvil, fume hood, drench, and other assorted staples of the artificing trade. I'd pushed the work table aside to leave half of the room empty except for several thick bales of straw stacked against the wall. Hanging from the ceiling in front of the bales was a crude scarecrow. I'd dressed it in my burned shirt and a pair of sackcloth pants. Part of me wished I'd run a few more tests in the time it had taken to sew the pants and stuff the straw man. But at the end of the day, I am a trooper first and all else second. As such, I couldn't ignore the chance for a little showmanship. I closed the door behind us while Kilvin looked around the room curiously. Deciding to let my work speak for itself, I brought out the crossbow and handed it to him. The huge master's expression went dark. Relarkvoth, he said, his voice heavy with disapproval. Tell me you have not squandered the labor of your hands on the improvement of such a beastly thing. Trust me, Master Kilvin, I said, holding it out to him. He gave me a long look, then took the crossbow and began to examine it with the meticulous care of a man who spent every day working with deadly equipment. He fingered the tightly woven string and eyed the curved metal arm of the bow. After several long minutes he nodded, put one foot through the stirrup, and cocked it without any noticeable effort. Idly I wondered how strong Kilvin was. My shoulders ached and my hands were blistered from struggling with the unwieldy thing over the last several days. I handed him the heavy bolt and examined it as well. I could see him looking increasingly perplexed. I knew why. The bow didn't have any obvious modifications or sigildry. Neither did the bolt. Kilvin slotted the bolt into the crossbow and raised an eyebrow at me. I made an expansive gesture to the straw man, trying to look more confident than I felt. My hands were sweating and my stomach was full of doves. Tests were fine and good. Tests were important. Tests were like rehearsal. But all that really matters is what happens when the audience is watching. This is a truth all troopers know. Kilvin shrugged and raised the crossbow. It looked small braced against his broad shoulder, and he took a moment to carefully sight along the top of it. I was surprised to see him calmly draw half a breath, then exhale slowly as he pulled the trigger. The crossbow jerked, the string twanged, the bolt blurred. There was a harsh metallic clank, and the bolt stopped mid-air as if it had struck an invisible wall. It clattered to the stone floor in the middle of the room, 15 feet away from the straw man. Unable to help myself, I laughed and threw my arms triumphantly into the air. Kilvin raised his eyebrows and looked at me. I grinned a manic grin. The master retrieved the bolt from the floor and examined it again. Then he recocked the crossbow, sighted, and pulled the trigger. Clank! The bolt dropped to the floor a second time, skittering slightly to one side. This time Kilvin spotted the source of the noise. Hanging from the ceiling in the far corner of the room was a metal object the size of a large lantern. It was rocking back and forth and spinning slightly, as if someone had just struck it a glancing blow. I took it off its hook and brought it back to where Master Kilvin waited at the work table. "What is this thing, Rilar Quoth?" he said curiously. I set it down on the table with a heavy clunk. "In general terms, Master Kilvin, it's an automatically triggered kinetic opposition device," I beamed proudly. "More specifically, it stops arrows." I'm going to take another drink of water because my voice is disappearing. Kilvin bent to look at it, but there was nothing to see except for featureless plates of dark iron. My creation looked nothing so much as a large 8-sided lantern made entirely of metal. And what do you call it? That was the one part of my invention I hadn't managed to finish. I'd thought of 100 names, but none of them seemed to fit. Arrow Trap was pedestrian. The Traveler's Friend was prosaic. Bandit Bane was ridiculously melodramatic. I could never have looked Kilvin in the eye if I'd tried to call it that. "I am having some trouble with the name," I admitted, "but for now I'm calling it an arrow catch." Kilvin grunted. "It does not catch the arrow precisely." "I know," I said, exasperated, "but it was either that or call it a clank." Kilvin looked at me sideways, his eyes smiling a little. "One would think a student of Eladin's would prove more facile with his naming," Rilar Quoth. "Delavari had it easy, Master Kilvin," I said. "He just made a better axle and stuck his name on it. I can't very well call this the Quoth." Kilvin chuckled. "True." He turned back to the arrow catch, eyeing it curiously. "How does it work?" I grinned and brought out a large roll of paper covered in diagrams, complicated sigildry, metallurgical symbols, and painstaking formulae for kinetic conversion. That's true. In 2021, that would be a perfect name. "There are two main parts," I said. "The first is the sigildry that automatically forms a sympathetic link with any thin, fast-moving piece of metal within 20 feet. I don't mind telling you, that took me a long couple of days to figure out." I tapped the appropriate runes of the piece of paper. At first I thought that might be enough by itself. I hoped if I bound an incoming arrowhead to a stationary piece of iron, it would absorb the arrow's momentum and make it harmless. Kilvin shook his head. "It has been tried before." "I should have realized before I even tried," I said. "At best, it only absorbs a third of the arrow's momentum, and at anyone 2/3 the arrow shot is still going to be in a bad way." I gestured to a different diagram. What I really needed was something that could push back against the arrow, and it had to push very fast and very hard. I ended up using the spring steel from a bear trap. Modified, of course. I picked up a spare arrowhead from the work table and pretended it was moving toward the arrow catch. First, the arrow comes close and establishes the binding. Second, the incoming arrow's momentum sets off the trigger, just like stepping on a trap. I snapped my fingers sharply. Then the spring's stored energy pushes back at the arrow, stopping it or even knocking it backward. Kilvin was nodding along. "If it needs to be reset after each use, how did it stop my second bolt?" I pointed to the central diagram. This wouldn't be of much use if it only stopped one arrow," I said. or if it only stopped arrows coming from one direction. I designed it to have 8 springs in a circle. It should be able to stop arrows from several directions at once. I shrugged apologetically. In theory. I haven't been able to test that. Kilvin looked back at the straw man. Both of my shots came from the same direction, he said. How was the second one stopped if that spring had already been triggered? I picked up the arrow catch by the ring I'd set into the top and showed it how... Sorry, I'm going to start that over. I picked up the arrow catch by the ring I'd set into the top and showed how it could rotate freely. It hangs on a pivot ring, I said. The shock of the first arrow set it spinning slightly, which brought a new spring into alignment. Even if it hadn't, the energy of the incoming arrow tends to swing it around to the nearest untriggered spring, like a weather vane points into the wind. I hadn't actually planned the last. It had been a lucky accident, but I didn't see any reason to tell Kilvin that. I touched the red dots visible on 2 of the 8 iron faces of the arrow catch. These show which springs have been triggered. Kilvin took it from me and turned it in his hands. How do you reset the springs? I slid a metal device out from under the work table, little more than a piece of iron with a long lever attached. Then I showed Kilvin the 8-sided hole in the bottom of the arrow catch. I fit the arrow catch onto the device and pressed down on the lever with my foot until I heard a sharp click. Then I rotated the arrow catch and repeated the process. Kilvin bent to pick it up and turned it over in his huge hands. Heavy, he commented. It needed to be sturdy, I said. A crossbow bolt can punch through a 2-inch oak plank. I needed the spring to snap back with at least 3 times that much force to stop the arrow. Kilvin shook the arrow catch idly, holding it to the side of his head. It didn't make any noise. And what if the arrowheads are not made of metal? He asked. Visembi raiders are said to use arrows of flint or obsidian. I looked down at my hands and sighed. Well, I said slowly, if the arrowheads aren't some sort of iron, the arrow catch wouldn't trigger when they came within 20 feet. Kilvin gave a non-committal grunt and set the arrow catch back down on the table with a thump. But, I said brightly, when it came within 15 feet, any piece of sharp stone or glass would trigger a different set of bindings. I tapped my schema. I was proud of it, as I'd also had the foresight to inscribe the inset pieces of obsidian with the sigildry for twice tough glass. That way they wouldn't shatter under the impact. Kilvin glanced at the schema, then grinned proudly and chuckled deep in his chest. Good, good. What if the arrow has a head of bone or ivory? The runes for bone aren't trusted to a lowly relar like myself, I said. And if they were? Kilvin asked. Then I still wouldn't use them, I said, lest some child doing a cartwheel triggers the arrow catch with a thin, quickly moving piece of his skull. Kilvin nodded his approval. I was thinking of a galloping horse, he said, but you show your wisdom in this. You show you have the careful mind of an artificer. I turned back to the schema and pointed. That said, Master Kilvin, at 10 feet a fast-moving cylindrical piece of wood will trigger the arrow catch. I sighed. It's not a good link, but it's enough to stop the arrow, or at least deflect it. Kilvin bent to examine the schema more closely, his eyes wandering the crowded page for a long couple of minutes. All iron? He asked. Closer to steel, Master Kilvin. I worried iron would be too brittle in the long term. And each of these 18 bindings are inscribed on each of the springs? He asked, gesturing. I nodded. That is a great duplication of effort, Kilvin said, his tone more conversational than accusatory. Some might say such a thing is overbuilt. I care very little what other people think, Master Kilvin, I said. Only what you think. He grunted, then looked up from the paper and turned to face me. I have 4 questions. I nodded expectantly. First, of all things, why make this? He asked. No one should ever die from ambush on the road, I said firmly. Kilvin waited, but I had nothing more to say on the matter. After a moment, he shrugged and gestured to the other side of the room. Second, where did you get his brow furrowed slightly. Tevet Bem, the flatbow. My stomach clenched at the question. I'd held the vain hope that Kilvin, being Sealdish, wouldn't know such things were illegal here in the Commonwealth. Barring that, I'd hoped he simply wouldn't ask. I procured it, Master Kilvin, I said evasively. I needed it to test the arrow catch. Why not use a simple hunter's bow? Kilvin said sternly, and thereby avoid the need of illegal procurement. It would be too weak, Master Kilvin. I needed to be sure my design would stop any arrow, and a crossbow fires a bolt harder than any other. A Modigan longbow is equal of a flatbow, Kilvin said. But the use of one is beyond my skill, I said, and the purchase of a Modigan bow is far beyond my means. Kilvin let out a deep sigh. Before, when you made your thieves' lamp, you made a bad thing in a good way. That I do not like. He looked down at the schema. This time, you have made a good thing in a bad way. That is better, but not entirely. Best is to make a good thing in a good way. Agreed? I nodded. He laid one massive hand on the crossbow. Did anyone see you with it? I shook my head. Then we will say it is mine, and you procured it under my advisement. It will join the equipment in stocks. He gave me a hard look. And in the future you will come to me if you need such things. That stung a bit, as I'd been planning on selling it back to Sleet. Still, it could have been worse. The last thing I wanted was to run afoul of the iron law. Third, I see no mention of gold wire or silver in your schema, he said. Nor can I imagine any use they could be put to in such a device as yours. Explain why you have checked these materials out of stocks. I was suddenly pointedly aware of the cool metal of my gram against the inside of my arm. Its inlay was gold, but I could hardly tell him that. I was short on money, Master Kilvin, and I needed materials I couldn't get in stocks. Such as your flatbow. I nodded. And the straw and the bear traps. Wrong follows wrong, Kilvin said disapprovingly. The stocks are not a moneylender's stall and should not be used as such. I am rescinding your precious metals authorization. I bowed my head, hoping I looked appropriately chastised. You will also work 20 hours in stocks as your punishment. If anyone asks, you will tell them what you did, and explain that, as a punishment, you were forced to repay the value of the metals, plus an additional 20%. If you use stocks as a moneylender, you will be charged interest like a moneylender. I winced at that. Yes, Master Kilvin. Last, Kilvin said, turning to lay one huge hand on the arrow catch. What do you imagine such a thing would sell for, Relarkvoth? My heart rose in my chest. Does that mean you approve it for sale, Master Kilvin? The great bear-like artificer gave me a puzzled look. Of course I approve it, Relarkvoth. It is a wondrous thing. It is an improvement to the world. Every time a person sees such a thing, they will see how artificery is used to keep men safe. They will think well of all artificers for the making of such a thing. But he looked down at the arrow catch, frowning thoughtfully. But if we are to sell it, it must have a price. What do you suggest? I had been wondering on this question for 6 span. The simple truth was, I'd hoped it would bring me enough money to pay for my tuition and my interest on Debbie's loan, enough to keep me in the university for one more term. I honestly don't know, Master Kilvin, I said. How much would you pay to avoid having a long yard of ash arrow shot through your lung? He chuckled. My lung is quite valuable, he said, but let us think in other terms. Materials come to... He glanced at the schema. Roughly 9 jots, am I correct? Uncannily correct. I nodded. How many hours did it take you to make? Hey! Sorry. Cats being cats. About 100, I said. Maybe 120. But a lot of that was experimentation and testing. I could probably make another in 50 or 60 hours. Fewer if moldings are made. Kilvin nodded. I suggest 25 talents. Does that seem reasonable to you? The sum took my breath away. Even after I repaid stocks for materials and the workshop took its 40% commission, it was 6 times more than I'd earned working on deck lamps. An almost ridiculous amount of money. I began to agree enthusiastically, then a thought occurred to me. Though it pained me, I slowly shook my head. Honestly, Master Kilvin, I'd prefer to sell them more cheaply than that. He raised an eyebrow. They will pay it, he reassured me. I have seen people pay more for less useful things. I shrugged. 25 talents is a lot of money, I said. Safety and peace of mind shouldn't only be available to those with heavy purses. I think 8 would be a great plenty. Kilvin looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. As you say, 8 talents. He ran his hand over the top of the arrow catch, almost petting it. However, as this is the first and only one in existence, I will pay you 25 for it. It will go in my personal collection. He cocked his head at me. Lin Sattva? Lin, I said gratefully, feeling a great weight of anxiety lifting off my shoulders. Kilvin smiled and nodded toward the table. I would also like to examine the schema at my leisure. Would you like to make me a copy? For 25 talents, I said, smiling as I slid the paper across the table. You can have the original. Kilvin wrote me a receipt and left, clutching the arrow catch like a child with a new favorite toy. I hurried to stocks with my slip of paper. I had to settle my debt for materials, including the gold wire and silver ingots, but even after the workshop took its commission, I was left with almost 11 talents. I went through the remainder of the day, grinning and whistling like an idiot. It is as they say, a heavy purse makes for a light heart. All right, and that's the end of that. So, cool. All right. Interesting stuff. that was actually a really cool thing he made. I was enjoying reading about that. And I'm glad he has money now. He never has money, and he deserves to have money. I'm sure something bad will happen where he loses all his money, though. Or he feels the need to spend it all on some emergency kind of thing. We'll see what happens next time. Thanks for tuning in. I can't even see how many people are here anymore. But we had more than usual here and there. That was cool. Alright. I'm going to end it here, and I'll see you guys on... yeah, I can't wait to see how he loses his money. I'll see you guys probably Sunday, I think. So, good night.